let's go ahead and get started. So today's session is Mimesis and Plagiarism, a place for copying and learning. Before I introduce you to our guest speaker, Anita Lundberg, I did want to just call for a moment of your attention to speak to you about an opportunity that we have available for one lucky winner each day, someone who completes the survey at the end of the webcast. We're giving away the opportunity for that person to choose a project on donorschoose.org. And for those of you who aren't familiar already, donorschoose.org is a place where teachers can go submit their projects for funding by the public at large. It's a fantastic organization, great idea, great approach. And what we're doing at Turnitin is we're giving one person each day the chance to donate to the project of their choice. And Turnitin will fund that project in the amount of $100. So if you want to be considered, please complete the survey at the end of the webcast. And now on to our presenter today. I want to take a moment to introduce you to our guest speaker, Anita Lundberg. Anita is an associate professor and cultural anthropologist at James Cook University, and she's currently exploring the ethnography of higher education. She's held many fellowships, has served as an anthropologist in residence. She's also convened a think tank at the Cairn Institute and curated exhibitions of research, theory, and artistic works across the world. In addition to that, Anita has received awards for outstanding teaching, research supervision, and innovative research, and she also serves on the editorial board of E-Tropics and the Indian Journal of Women's Studies. We are very pleased to have Anita join us today. Anita, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. It's very early in the morning where I am, so it's a lovely start to the day.
Well, thank you so much, Anita. Anita, the session is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you. I'm just seeing, I'm not going on to my first slide. Sorry, I'm learning how to operate all these different systems that I'm on at the same time. So I just want to set a little bit of a scene to begin with. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Basically, I'm on an offshore campus of an Australian university in tropical Singapore. So I send you all warmth from tropical Singapore in case you're in any cold climates at the moment. Singapore is an education hub. It draws in students from around Asia and around the world. It's a significant education hub. Many of our students are coming from Confucius heritage backgrounds and also other Eastern philosophical backgrounds. I'm a first-year experience coordinator at the Singapore campus, and I serve many first-year students as well as upper-level classes as well, and obviously PhD theses, etc. My background is in cultural anthropology, and what I've been trying to do is use concepts from a very interdisciplinary practice that I have in anthropology to reflect back onto the classroom and my experiences of teaching up here in Singapore. You'll notice by my accent that I'm originally Australian. I've also worked extensively in Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia. I've spent time in France with research as well, and now I've been here in Singapore for about 5 years. So a lot of my work has become theoretically informed by both Eastern and Western philosophies. I've got a philosophy background, as well as things like phenomenology, network theories, quantum physics, and rhizomatic. This is stuff that I use in some of those philosophies. But today I'd like to speak about some of those Eastern and Western philosophies with the notions of mimesis, plagiarism, and the notion of copying to learn. When I first came up here to Singapore to teach, even though I'd lived in Eastern countries, I was very much of the mindset that copying is bad and original thought is very good. Creative thought, original thought, thinking outside the box, as I keep telling my students. And I had this mindset. It's taken me a long time to think past that, and are we doing the right things by our students by just having this idea of original as good, copying bad. So basically, I had Western assumptions, not necessarily about Asian education systems, but the Western assumptions underlying my own knowledge background have a certain idea about Asian education systems as being based often on copying as a form, or rote learning, we say in Australia. I hope it's the same sort of words that you use wherever you are. And I think some of these should be questioned. I think that Asian educational practices can actually supplement Western systems in very, very helpful ways. And that's basically all I'm going to be going through today, how some of those could work. So when I first came up to Singapore, I had really little idea about copy practice at all. My cultural setting is from Australia, so I'm in this education hub in Asia with many, many Asian students. There was a lot of work to be done with English as an academic language and academic writing skills. I think I was first alerted to a problem when my students in a first semester anthropology subject, when I said, gave them instructions on how to write their essay, and this is the essay question, this is what you have to write. And a few students were very, very brave in putting up their hands, because our students aren't always very vocal. They basically said, well, how do you write an essay? And my answer to that was, well, do you mean an anthropology essay? And I sort of outlined that some of the differences that it would be to an essay, say, in psychology or in business. But the students actually said, no, how do you write an essay in a Western university setting, or how do you write an essay? I was quite alarmed by this at first, and I really didn't know how to handle it. So it took a while to get into that idea of, hang on, my students really don't necessarily know how to write an essay in a Western academic setting. So I became very, very interested in the fact that, in fact, I had fieldwork right on my doorstep. Here I was teaching in Singapore, where the Singaporean students come from a Eastern cultural heritage background, as well as all the other students that we're bringing in. So it was very much a Western education system with Eastern heritage students. And I started to become alert to the binary, this dichotomy between the idea of copying as bad and original as good. And I wanted to question that and actually break down that binary a bit. So to go beyond the binary also of Western education and Asian education, and see the flows between them, how that we can use these different practices in useful ways in particular settings. I became interested and worked with my colleague Michael Joyce, whom I've written a paper with, on copying practice. And all the copying practice is basically based around noticing and absorbing. But how do we really define, and how do we teach people how to notice, and what do we really mean by absorbing? I'm going to go through a few examples today. I'm going to be using some ideas from professional writers, not necessarily academic writers, but people who actually earn their income from writing. I'm going to go through some Eastern philosophy, some very basic stuff, and I'm going to look at some Western philosophy and science as well, to give us a background on how we can start to think about these things, but also think about how we've been brought up in a practice of a Western education and Western philosophy that underlines all our educational understanding. When I look at professional writers, many of those writers are instructing people that in order to write better, you actually copy better writers. Now, I don't think we have a problem with that in academia. We hear often put in example essays for students so that they know what a good essay looks like. This has become a very profound practice at the university I'm at. We have several learning advisors that help in this practice. We help the academics with this practice. And in all my classes now, I have example essays of what that particular project would look like, whether that is an essay or whether it's something to do with film and a film portfolio. Whatever it is, I try to make this available to the student. And I always find it's a very interesting process. How do you get a student to understand the structure or what is expected of an essay and what a good essay looks like without them actually copying that essay. And that's where we get into a difficulty. We strongly advise students not to copy the essay. We strongly advise on plagiarism, that basically plagiarism is not just the practice of copying. Plagiarism when you take somebody else's work and you try to pull it off as your own work. That's the difference here. We're not encouraging students to ever plagiarize. We've got very, very strong practices of referencing, etc. But what we do want to do is students to learn what that better work looks like and be able to maybe copy structure of essays, for instance. So having an introduction, what does an introduction look like? Your different paragraphs, and what does a conclusion look like? I found it very interesting with some of my Chinese students that in fact they don't write conclusions. Their logic is, well, I've already said everything in the essay, why would I conclude? And especially a summary of what you've done in the essay as a conclusion doesn't make a lot of cultural sense from where they're coming from. As I talk about the different writers, philosophers today, I'm really looking at all the time at what they're noticing in their work, what do we need to notice to improve our work, and also the notion of absorbing. This one's a little bit more difficult. Some people have looked at absorbing as an unconscious practice, or the practice becomes unconscious. And other people, especially say post-feminist writers, will talk about the notion of embodiment, actually embodying a particular practice. So writers and artists, professional writers and artists, have named noticing and absorbing as two major benefits of copying to learn. There's a guy called Schmidt who points out that it's an important aspect of language learning, especially, and this is of great concern to us with our English as for academic purposes programs, and students who are weaker in English, although they do learn so much when they're at the university. Often teachers will prepare exercises such as grammatical consciousness raising activities to encourage their students to notice certain features of language in order to be able to repeat those features back. Absorbing, though, is a more controversial issue. The creative practitioners described today that I'm going through don't clearly elaborate on what they mean by absorbing. The notion of embodiment is invoked, but also notions of subconscious or unconscious learning have been taken up for analysis. And then we have some people who think that they've become unconscious practices, but other people refute that and criticize those views, stating that unconscious practice is not possible. The point for this short presentation really is that multiple independent creative professionals working in different fields elucidate that some sort of subliminal or embodied learning occurs when people copy to learn. My contention is that their experiences should be acknowledged. Vivi Denham, for instance, is a novelist and a blogger, and details her experiences with copying to learn. She decided to copy out one chapter from a book in order to more fully understand what made the writing outstanding. And in a blog post entitled, "You Can Learn to Write by Copying Great Authors," she comments, "I typed the first chapter of The Help, every comma and quotation mark, incredibly eye-opening," she states. "I dove into the words, felt them, experienced them, noticing details I hadn't when reading. For me, the absence of being verbs blared in my face." So she's stating here that it's not just a matter of reading. In order to notice and then absorb, it's a matter of rewriting out whole books or whole paragraphs maybe for our students. She presents a list of other features of writing that she intends to analyse during future copying sessions. And again, she states that she can't do this simply by reading. She has to actually copy it out, sometimes by hand, sometimes by computer. Lorraine Thompson is a professional copywriter. And she states, she works in New York, and she also writes a blog post. She states that copy work gives you insights into the writer's intentions and choices. It makes you pause to ask, while Scott F. Fitzgerald imagined a stairway to the sky before the moment when Gatsby kisses Daisy, or notice how Hemingway's absence of words evokes more powerful emotion than lesser writers' explanations and descriptions. She also claims it can help students notice their own mistakes and bad habits through observing other writers' good habits. Copy work, as she calls it, I call it copy practice, helps to, and I quote here, identify bad writing habits such as passive voice, weak verbs, and stale metaphors by absorbing great writers' good habits. She also touts copying to learn as a way to improve one's knowledge of punctuation, grammar, and spelling. And these are all areas in which students struggle, and I find that my students struggle. This is a quote here from Johnny Depp writing about Hunter S., or commenting on Hunter S. Thompson. Johnny Depp starred in a couple of movies of Hunter S. Thompson, and they were very close friends. He speaks of Hunter S. Thompson, quote, he'd look at each page of that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, and he copied it, the entire book, and more than once, because he wanted to know what it felt like to write a masterpiece. So here we have the notion of absorbing coming through more closely. He wanted to feel what it was like to write in that way. Also on absorbing, I have a quote here from James Gurney, who's most famous for his book, I think, Dinotopia, or series Dinotopia. And I quote again, we can build on the accomplishments of those who came before. Copying was an integral part of the academic training process. And here he's speaking about artists. Students were expected to spend time in the museums doing small pencil or pen sketches called croquis, or croquis in English, to absorb the big structure of the paintings. And then they also spent time making painted copies of works. This was considered almost a mystical process of letting the earlier master's spirit into you. This particular description of absorbing is quite interesting. It has the idea of the mystical. And mystical is not a term that most teaching and learning academics like to use in their work. However, the mystical process of absorbing elucidated above is very similar to what other unrelated artists have described when they discuss experience with copying to learn. It's a theme that recurs often, and it recurs in different fields, stated in various voices. My contention here is that if these professionals who make their living from the strength of the creative skills claim that copying to learn helps people absorb the skills of more adept practitioners, educators would also be wise to heed these voices, take note of these people who are professionals. All of these professionals claim that copying to learn produces real, tangible benefits for practitioners, helping them notice and absorb the features and qualities of the work they aspire to. Copying enables them to learn to become successful writers and artists, or in our case, it could be used for success for students. I now want to turn to Eastern philosophies. We had the word mystical just recently, and I think we often think of Eastern philosophies as being more mystical. They're not necessarily, in fact, they're incredibly practice-driven. But again, there's this notion of noticing and observing as we look at some of the philosophical practices that come out of the East. I think in the context of cross-cultural discussions regarding copying, we choose to refer to I'm choosing here to refer to classic writings of Westerners on Eastern practices, a move that may provoke the accusation that these are not original text in Eastern philosophy. However, I think it's really important that we notice that Western practitioners have been interested in Eastern philosophy practices for a long time, and that we actually have this tradition of translating Eastern philosophies to Western audiences. All the books that I mention here are, in fact, classics in their own rights now. The first one that I'm going to look at is Confucius, The Secular is Sacred. It was written by Herbert Vinaigrette in 1972. It draws the reader's attention to the presence of magic in Confucius' Analects, which is a series of writings, a collection of writings. This magic refers to an intangible power that a leader can draw on. And this is done through the notion of li, or everyday ritual practice. Vinaigrette attempts to invoke the magical quality of secular ritual through an example from Western society. He chooses the notion of the handshake here, or the practice of the handshake. This ritual greeting, and we don't think of it as a ritual greeting, we think of it as just a practice, as what we call normal, and some people call natural. But it is a ritual greeting, and to us it seems completely natural. In effect, it's highly complex. It works at multiple levels with multiple meanings. If you get your handshake wrong, you can ruin a business proposition, for instance. I sometimes point this out to my students with another practice, which is kissing sides of cheeks as a greeting that is used in France, for instance, and point out that in different parts of France you kiss the cheek a certain amount of times. It could be 2, it could be 3 times, and you've got to get that right. So for someone not knowing the practice of a handshake, for instance, it would be fraught with anxiety. We think of it as completely automatic and have difficulty even noticing it at all, precisely because we've actually absorbed and embodied handshaking. Yet the difficulty of first learning this practice is enormous. It can only be copied to learn, noticing and feeling its nuances, absorbing the practice with our hands and our bodies, until one day, magically, it seems, it just happens, as if of its own volition. The term li is translated as rites, ceremonies, customs, rituals, or etiquette, and is associated with moral refinement in Confucius heritage cultures. Basically, li refers to the secular functions of everyday life that we often call culture. To achieve the grace of any secular ritual, whether shaking hands or writing an academic essay, necessitates ritual copying. Under the notion of li, Confucius also included education. So there's a very strong notion of learning and copying ritualistically in order to learn in Confucian heritage societies. The next text I'm going to look at is Zen and the Art of Archery. It was written in 1953 and is a classic text by Eugene Herrigel on Japanese Zen Buddhism. One of the key messages of this best-selling book is that the student studiously practices repetitive tasks. And through this concentrated practice, the physical activity, whether archery or writing, eventually becomes effortless as the body absorbs a complex and difficult task without conscious exertion from the mind. The central tenet of Zen is that it is impossible to understand by intellectual pursuit alone. To master any art, technical knowledge is not sufficient. One has to reach a point of absorption. Herrigel notes, and I quote, that the technically learnable part of it must be practiced to the point of repletion. And he later states that the archer ceases to be conscious of himself as the one who is engaging in hitting the bullseye, which confronts him. So it becomes a state of unconsciousness or subconscious, which is realized through being empty of self. You're not noticing yourself doing it any longer. You're just absorbed in the task. A more practical example here could be learning to drive. When we're first learning to drive, it's all about trying to learn how to do it. It's very, very clumsy until it becomes an absorbed practice. The same is with essays. If we keep practicing them, if we keep practicing our writing, it becomes absorbed and it becomes more automatic. The third example from Eastern philosophies is this beautiful book, The Tao of Pooh by Benjamin Hoff, which was another bestseller. It explains the way of Taoism through the famous Western children's character, Winnie the Pooh. The practice of Wu Wei is central to Taoist philosophy and often expressed by the paradox Wei Wu Wei, which means action without action. Basically, it's referring to effortless doing, automatic doing. The point of Wu Wei is alignment with the Tao, revealing the soft and invisible power within all things. And masters of Wu Wei are believed to be able to absorb and follow this invisible potential. It's basically about a lively but passive receptiveness. Now, the flow of Tao is often practiced in the graceful movements of Tai Chi, a ritual that requires copying over and over again highly specific movements. And in order to achieve this, it's a matter of noticing and absorbing until those movements become effortless and flow. So these popular texts on Eastern philosophy, written by Westerners, demonstrate nuanced, engaged practice, and they have helped build understanding between Eastern and Western philosophies. However, also of interest are critiques of these works in which they are denigrated as mere imitations. They're not considered original Eastern texts. This is the struggle that writers of mimesis have dealt with in Western philosophy since the ancient Greek philosophers. This dualistic notion pervasively affects our thinking, which harbour dark concerns about the practice of copying to learn. We still have an idea that we have either original thought and creative thought or copying thought, which is considered a lesser form of knowing. I'm now going to move on to Western example from a few Western philosophers and speak about mimesis or mimesis. Basically, it's the imitation of gestures, imitation of words, and imitations of actions. Mimesis was widely considered in pre-Platonic thought, but it is with Plato that it takes on a particular meaning that still affects our understandings today. And this is an image here of Plato and Aristotle. And I'm going to speak about both of these philosophers. Here it's actually quite interesting in this image from the Renaissance painter Raphael, that Plato is pointing skywards while Aristotle has his hand looking downwards. Plato had an idea of the ideals ideal forms, whereas Aristotle worked on the ideas of the things around us, understanding, noticing what's happening around us in the present day life. So with Plato, mimesis takes on a particular meaning that still affects our understandings today. In the Republic, he theorized that the mimetic world is inherently inferior to the real world. And the mimetic world consists of imitations that are subordinate to their original. Mimicry was considered part of aesthetics like art, and it creates appearances and illusions. It is considered inauthentic, deceptive, and inferior, actually quite suspect and corrupt. It is not the real and the original. Mimesis is a mediation we must get beyond in order to experience the real. The real for Plato also might not be our everyday experiences here in the world. The real might be outside of what we experience. And he did this famously in his allegory of the cave. More recently, we can think of artworks films, in fact, that have been influenced by this notion. The Matrix is a very, very good example of the idea that our everyday life is inherently unreal and it's an illusion. And we have to get beyond that somehow to the real. Hence Plato's image in the previous painting where he's pointing skywards, the real was above us. In contrast to Plato, Aristotle, who was Plato's student, considers in his Poesis mimesis as a fundamental human inclination. Humans, he believes, stand apart from other animals due to our proclivity for imitation. We learn our first lessons through this ability. We learn how to speak through this ability. Aristotle imagines mimesis as expressions of our experience with and in the world. Our mimetic ability is our means of learning about nature, a perceptual experience that enables us to get closer to the real. So we've got a movement away from Plato in Aristotle's Poesis. Unfortunately, what we've tended to look at in Western philosophies is the Platonic tradition. However, in the 1900s, there were several writers who started to go back towards Aristotle's idea and away from the Platonic ideas that were being taught at that time. In the 20th century, the critical theorist Walter Benjamin was amongst thinkers who conceived of mimesis through social and interpersonal relations. His writings are particularly noted for the return to a conception of mimesis as an intrinsic human quality. In his famous essay on the mimetic faculty, he states, and I quote, "Nature creates similarities. One need only think of mimicry. The highest capacity for producing similarities, however, is man's. His gifts of seeing resemblances is nothing other than a rudiment of the powerful compulsion in former times to become and behave like something else." Walter Benjamin argues that language is the highest level of mimetic behaviour. For him, it is a linguistic concept, offering the writer, for instance, a way to find meaning in the world through noticing of similarities which become absorbed and re-articulated in language. These ideas have also been taken up by anthropologists and other philosophers. Post-feminist philosophers use these same notions. But it's also very, very interesting that bodily mimesis is not solely a human ability. Mimicry in nature has been radically articulated in Roger Caillois' famous work, Mimicry and Legendary Psychoanaesthesia, the original of which was written in 1938 and then reprinted in 1984. Through detailed analyses set in tropical jungle locations, he describes the lush mimetic capacities and capabilities of various insects. And he demonstrates that in the processes of mimicry, insects go beyond imitation just purely for survival, which is what I always learnt at school, that it was just for survival as part of evolution. He points out, very interestingly, that in fact they do more. They seem to embellish. And by stating this, he's actually pointing out that mimesis, even in nature, is creative. So mimicry, rather than just copying, goes to a point where it goes beyond the copy and becomes something more. So noteworthy in these accounts from Western philosophy and philosophy of science is how mimesis through gestures, art, language, bodies, biology, and evolutionary practice and co-evolution strongly evokes notions of absorbing. One thing that we practice turns us into another thing, another being, for instance. Furthermore, mimesis suggests noticing. It is not just the bark of the tree that an insect mimics, but the lichen on the bark is mimicked. It's not just a leaf that an insect mimics, but also the precise movement of the leaf swaying in the breeze. So copying to learn or copying to become are inherent in both humans and nature. The image that you see here is a wonderful one. Obviously, this insect, it's a praying mantis, lives with flowers, and it's actually got parts of that flower embedded in it. There's particular praying mantises that inhabit orchids in the tropical zone, and we have great orchid gardens here in Singapore, if any of you are going to visit. And they actually inhabit those orchids, and they look exactly like the orchids. So this is just a beautiful image for that one. I want to go on to now student experience. Some students have already begun to use the method of copying to learn without any teacher prompting. And I just want to give one example we have here, which was from a personal communication with my colleague, Michael Joyce. This is a student who's actually failed our program for English as a language proficiency and our tests that we do. Went back to his home country and then wrote to Michael. And he writes this, and this was in an email, and it was a correspondence that was going back and forth between Michael and the student. So it was pretty rapid correspondence, not over days or weeks, it was just in one session. The student states, before I entered ELPP, which is our English language preparatory program, I did not have any English foundation. When I communicated with other people, body language and some simple words always were the best tools for me. The biggest difficulties always were vocabulary and speaking skills. I still remember that I said only smoke and point to the shelf when I went to 7-Eleven for buying cigarettes. I even can't describe by languages how difficult and embarrassing was the situation. It was natural for some people to say that, I will delete the student's name here, can't survive the ELPP program. Now we can see here that the student has got some punctuation, not really punctuation difficult as much as a lowercase I where it should be an uppercase I, and there's some vocabulary problems there and some words that are not quite right. Smoke, for instance, so some spelling problems there. However, this is perfectly understandable what he's trying to put across. Mike wrote back to him and asked him what he'd been doing, and he'd been practicing for his test. And he did this by actually copying out tests that he would be having to do. They would be different tests, but he was copying out previous students' work. And basically, he was trying to give advice to Mike about copying methods that he was using. And he states this. First of all, the key of the method is to understand and analyze what are the meaning of sentences and how grammar and vocabulary work together. Secondly, students should remember those sentences and try to replace some words in order to express their own thoughts in writing. Finally,
When students practice this method several times with teachers' correction, they will be capable of doing most general writing. Our job is to pursue the proficiency in English, so no one can deny that imitation is the most efficient method for learning English. And this comes from a student. What's remarkable about the student is that in fact he did fail our ELPP, and he failed it actually often, and repeated it at multiple levels. But the passages above are written in haste. There's been no proofreading of them, and yet he has actually been able to manage to learn how to write English. So in this regard, the mimetic faculty, mimicking or copying, is not just about copying. It becomes actually a creative act. It becomes an embodied practice. But also is the practice of becoming a student, an English-speaking student, in the case of this particular student writing from his home country. So while modern educators emphasize quality and original thought over copying, evidence does suggest that we should reconsider these ideas. Creative professionals describe copying as an activity that helps them immensely, and they describe an activity that is equally worthwhile for language learners. Copying can help practitioners notice features of the skill they are studying. For language, this means noticing aspects of grammar that reading may not help them see clearly. It helps them absorb important elements of the skills of the people that they copy. And this idea echoes both ancient Eastern philosophical ideas from Confucius, Zen, and Taoist practices, and many of these ideas resonate with long Western philosophy and philosophy of science debates about the concept of mimesis and mimicry in the human and as well as the natural realm. And given that Western philosophy's basis in dualist thinking, it is notoriously difficult for Western universities to move beyond the bias that continues to reintroduce the dualism of original and copy. And this is despite a sustained work in this area by Western philosophers. So basically what we wanted to point out with this particular work is that preliminary evidence from Asian students indicates copying could be a powerful tool for us to be using in Western universities. And academics should reconsider the secular ritual of copying and its place in learning. And at that stage, I'd like to stop, and I just have here some references if you'd like to look those up. And I hope I can hand back over to Jason at this point.
Yes, thank you, Anita. We had a little bit of audio difficulty there. I'm not sure why. Maybe because you are so far away.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. I don't think it's on you. Audience, thank you for bearing with some of the audio challenges. Anita, thank you so much for presenting. Just looking at it, taking a quick glance at the comments, there's some fantastic feedback on sort of what you shared with us. I think all of us felt that was incredibly enlightening, and I'd love to give the opportunity now for folks to ask some questions. And just in case those of you, in case folks are curious, if you want access to those references, we can certainly share those out with you. So we can make that available to you following the session. So let's go to some of the questions that come through, Anita. The first one is from Melissa, and she says, hi there, where do you find the example essays to show students? I think she was talking about the mentor texts or exemplar texts. There are several sites that have a library of example essays, but it seems like in academia, this is still something that is not condoned as a practice to start brainstorm or research for an essay assignment. So what are your thoughts and suggestions around that, Anita?
Right. What I've been doing is I'll give them an example essay that would have originally came out from Australia on the particular topic that they're dealing with. And since then, I've actually used examples from previous students' work. We removed the student's identification and we put that up. One of the things that I have been doing is I do change my essay questions around quite regularly. And what I do is I always tell the students that this is a former essay and point out what are some of the question differences that they will be getting to make sure that they don't actually fall into a trap of just copying that essay. That actually gets you away from copying practice. Another thing that I'm doing is we have learning advisors at our university as well, which the students can go to. I actually get the learning advisors to come into the classroom, and one of those learning advisors actually asks for a draft essay from the student before he comes into the classroom to do the essay writing session. All the students have to bring a draft with them, the draft of their essay, and they work in groups to look at, have I done this, have I done that, do I have topic sentences in my paragraphs, etc. Have I got a structure, have I got an introduction, have I got a conclusion, have I done my referencing correctly. But what the learning advisor is, he gets a brave student, he always asks for a brave student to give a draft of their essay, and then we put up comments about what's happening in those particular parts of the essay. So what we're doing is track changes, keeping track changes in to show students in our example essays and in draft essays where they have to look at, what they're actually having to look at. And so we'll put up a track change saying, this is a topic sentence. See how it introduces what this paragraph is about. So that's what we're doing. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that does help. In fact, you've kind of answered in part a question that was posed by Chris. Chris had asked, what would be a way to leverage the value of mimesis in dealing with a student who seems to lack writing skills below what would be expected for a college student? Sounds like some of what you suggested with the learning advisor as well as what you're doing in the classroom are good ways to address some of that. But maybe you can shed some additional light on that as well.
Yes, look, it's a real concern for us in many universities now. Our students don't seem to be prepared as we previously thought we were. I don't know how that actually happened in my education, but obviously there's this idea that a lot of them don't know how to write essays. So that's one way of doing it, having an example up where you actually put in the track changes. So you're pointing out what is good practice. You're also pointing out things that are difficult, pointing out that is this a good title for the essay? Could this be a better title? So you actually engaging the students in to be able to notice, and that's where the difficulty is, actually noticing these things. So we're actually doing that as examples. I hope that does address that question a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you for that, Anita. It sounds like it certainly does. I want to turn attention now to a question that's come in from Jane, because, Anita, you've done a really nice job in sort of setting up the framework for how instructors might be able to use mimesis within the context of the classroom. But there's also questions of how do you perhaps stage this out in the form of a process. I mean, certainly this is not something that you do once and you're done with, but maybe there are stages involved. So Jane's question is, could you comment on the similarities and differences between remembering sentences and replacing a few words to learn how the grammar and vocabulary work together versus writing the sentences from a published resource and replacing a few words as a form of paraphrasing in an assignment for graduate school? She goes on to ask, am I being too strict when I expect students to phrase their ideas in their own words?
No, you're not being too strict when you're expecting students to phrase it in their own words. So the idea of paraphrasing, in fact, is the idea that you put it into your own words, and we do teach that. What I'm doing here is basically different levels of work. One of the first things that I had to do was try and get my students to actually have some sort of structure to the essay. That was the main problem that I was dealing with in the beginning, mainly because I couldn't read the words and what they were doing without that structure. So that's one process of it, having that structure and students working on that structure. The second process does engage with the idea of, well, here we've got two different levels. By the time they get out of the ELPP programs and they're with me in first year subjects, a lot of them can actually write sentences reasonably well with quite a lot of difficulties, but they can write sentences. So I think that is a different stage. If they're still at the stage where they can't write sentences, it becomes very difficult. So the first stage would be copying sentences and replacing it with your own words. And that's not an easy task because you actually have to actually have to understand those words. And if they go and you look up online thesaurus, they always end up with words that don't actually make sense in the context. So that's them learning context, the different words in context of what they're trying to say and how those words work. But they understand the grammar, the punctuation, the sentence structure in that particular way. Later we do work more on paraphrasing. If you're taking somebody else's idea, you must reference it, but you need to paraphrase that. And that's not just changing a couple of words. That's another skill level where you actually change around that whole sentence. I don't actually do the on-the-ground work on that. The learning advisors do it, but we do have sessions where the students can come in and join workshops where they learn how to do that, how it's more than just changing one or two words, but it's actually putting it into your own words. And that involves also rethinking some of the ideas there and restructuring the whole sentence. I'm not sure if that's really useful, but I hope I've addressed it to some degree.
Thank you, Anita. There is a question that follows on that one, and this one's from Joy. And Joy wants you to talk a little bit more about how plagiarism comes into play here. So Joy first states, yes, copying can be a useful way to learn English. However, copying does not equal plagiarizing. When students quote words from a source, they need to be copying. So how does this presentation relate to plagiarism issues? Where do we draw the line?
Yeah, I think that's our really, really big question here. Where do we draw that line? And of course, it's very difficult to draw. We do a lot of work with the students talking about what is plagiarism. So when you're copying for practice, that's one thing. But if you're trying to, and we do a lot of work also. I do it in one of my anthropology classes. I teach across arts and social sciences, but one of the things is anthropology. I do it there where I actually get the students to take a picture each week, a photograph each week, and get a quote from the reading and put it with the picture. And in that, I'm teaching them how to quote, so their quoted words are exactly the same as the author's words, and then they learn to reference that as well. So they do an in-text citation and a reference at the bottom. This is over several weeks. All the class does it. They start to really enjoy it. And they also work together in groups where they become critical friends, pointing out if there's any words wrong or if any of the referencing is wrong. So what I'm trying to teach at the same time is referencing practice. So strongly do this idea of this is an essay, this is how you do it, this is the structure. The ELPP is strongly working on getting students to do a more sort of rote learn style, and then we do this idea that you must have a quote that actually is exact. Then there's the idea on top of that if you're paraphrasing an idea, you still must credit that to the author. I'm trying to do it where it's not the notion that plagiarism is bad and you're going to get into trouble as soon as you put it into Turnitin or one of the other plagiarism software things. And students get very, very uptight about that. One of the things I do try to do to change it around slightly with referencing is that if students have an idea and they put it down and they put it in, or they change and paraphrase someone's idea and put it into their own words, what they're doing by referencing that is backing up that idea or backing up those words that they put down themselves. So referencing becomes a very positive attitude to backing up your work. And I believe you have another presentation that is around about those ideas of referencing as networks. So I try to put it to them as that referencing, you're not going to get in trouble because that you have to reference and you have to cite these people and you have to copy these people. What you have to do is back up your ideas that you're putting and back up your argument in this essay. So in fact, those beautiful words of another person that you've read, that now you've changed into your own words, if you cite that person, you're giving your work more substance. It becomes more important.
Thank you, Anita. And folks, unfortunately, we've run up against the end of our time today. Anita, I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insight today. And as you can see here, Anita has shared some information. If you care to follow her on Twitter, you can. And then again, folks, we'll make some of this information available to you via email. So particularly the reference list that Anita had shared with you all. So Anita, thank you again, especially for getting up so early and joining us today and presenting to our audience.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you for being there on the other end of that. Thank you all for coming along, and this was a wonderful way to wake up. I woke up in the dark and now it's light. I can go to work now.
Thank you, Anita. On that note, have a great day. Folks, I do have one quick reminder for you, and that is we have on this Thursday a special webcast where we're going to be sharing with you a little demo of our new Turnitin Feedback Studio. So if you're interested in joining, that session is going to be on Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific time. We do look forward to joining us there, as well as in the other sessions that we have for Writing X Tech this week. So please join us for the rest of this week's sessions. Thank you for joining today. Thank you again, Anita. And everyone, we look to see and hear from you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.